Hello again, everybody. We're going to continue talking about the battles in Virginia. We just got done talking about the Peninsula Campaign, which was a failed attack on Richmond. Confederate commander Robert E. Lee was able to force the Union to retreat by attacking for a period of 7 days, and after each of those attacks, McClellan, the Union commander, retreated. We also talked about how Abraham Lincoln was so mad about this that he actually created a whole nother army and put a man by the name of John Pope in charge of that army. And he orders John Pope to march to Richmond and defeat the Confederates. But we're going to talk about how that also turns into another loss for the Union Army. And to do that, we're going to go to a different animation here, just to show you that. Maybe we're going to go to a different animation. Okay, and we're back. So here's the animation. And this shows us kind of where things are after the Peninsula Campaign. We have down here, we have McClellan, who is just pushed off the peninsula and is going to be making his way back by sea towards Washington, D.C. Robert E. Lee, meanwhile, here's reports about General John Pope making his way down here to attack Richmond. So he very quickly gets his soldiers together, and they march north to meet with Pope. So the L red circle here represents Robert E. Lee, and the J represents Stonewall Jackson, a member of Robert E. Lee's troops. And so these two armies, they hear about Pope marching down, so they very quickly make their way to meet Pope. Pope doesn't want to fight a battle, and Lee again takes a chance and decides to send his Stonewall Jackson Corps around Pope and make them head towards Washington. He had hoped that Pope wouldn't attack his troops, but would go after Jackson's, and that's exactly what they did. General John Pope was so fixated on defeating Stonewall Jackson, the famous Stonewall Jackson from First Bull Run, that he becomes so focused on Jackson that he forgets about Robert E. Lee's troops. And so you'll see Jackson here starts to make his way north towards Washington. Pope chases him, and Pope eventually catches him. And they catch him right nearby where the Battle of First Bull Run took place, right in the same area that the First Battle of Bull Run took place. And it is now August of 1862, so just over a year later, these two armies are here in the same battlefield that they had fought the First Battle of Bull Run. Meanwhile, as Pope is chasing Jackson, Lee is sneaking up behind Pope and is very cautiously coming over to the side of Pope's army. Now, when this happens, Lee wants to take care of Pope before McClellan can come up and reinforce him. So they do this relatively quickly. Now, here is the battlefield of First Bull Run. And just to point out, this crossroads here shows you where things happen. Remember, the first part of the battle took place here on Matthew Hill, and then Henry Hill, where the second part of the battle, and Jackson stood like a stone wall, and then the stone house located right here. So these three areas are the areas of the first Battle of Bull Run. Well, Stonewall Jackson has brought his troops here, and they have entrenched themselves in a little ditch that was an unfinished railroad line. And from here, they wait for the Union Army to show up where they are going to attack them. And their job is to hold on as long as they can until Robert E. Lee and the rest of the Confederates can come off secretly and attack the Union. So here's the Union line shows up, and General John Pope launches an attack on Jackson's corps, one right after another. And each time these attacks are stopped. It gets so bad for Jackson's troops that they run out of bullets, and they actually start throwing rocks at the Union soldiers to try and stop them. But each of these attacks for the Union are unsuccessful. And what they really are doing is they're drawing their attention away from the rest of the Confederate Army that has now snuck up onto the side of them. And at this point, Robert E. Lee launches his soldiers into the side of the Union Army, which is very dangerous for the Union Army, and basically pushes them all back. And again, this means that the Battle of Second Bull Run in August of 1862 is another Union loss. Robert E. Lee has now defeated the Union at 7 Days Battle and now at the Battle of Second Bull Run. Okay? So this is a big major development, and again, embarrassing for President Lincoln. He knows that the Union Army has more men, but he can't find a general to use those men in the proper way to win the war. And so the last note here for this slide is that Lee and Jackson's troops stopped Pope's army at Second Bull Run. And the Second Battle of Bull Run becomes another Confederate victory. Okay, so let's recap some of the battles we've talked about here. We've talked about the first Battle of Bull Run, Confederate victory. We talked about the Ironclad Battle. That was a Union victory. We talked about the 7 Days Battles, another Confederate victory. And we just completed talking about Second Battle of Bull Run, which is another Confederate victory. Okay? Now, before we move on, let's talk about some of these people in a little bit more depth and add these things to our notes. First, we have Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He was the graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, as many of these guys were. He fought in the Mexican-American War in 1848. He was from a town called Lexington, Virginia, and he's buried there today. And he taught at a college in that town called the Virginia Military Institute, or VMI, before the war. And that college is still there today. He gained his nickname at First Bull Run when his troops stood like a stone wall. Of course, we know that from when we talked about Bull Run. And throughout the course of the war, he was Robert E. Lee's most important general. He dies before the war is over, and he actually dies by, from a disease that wasn't part of the war. But he also has the fame of being shot by his own men during the battle, during a battle. And we're going to talk more about that as we get further on into the Civil War. Stonewall Jackson. Okay, another important name that you need to remember here is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was born into a wealthy family in Virginia in 1807. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was one of George Washington's best generals, and actually his father spoke at George Washington's funeral. Now, Robert E. Lee and his father didn't really know each other very well. His father left his mother with a lot of debts and moved to the Caribbean to get away from those debts. But so he was basically raised by his mother, and he goes to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And when he gets out of college, he falls in love with a relative of George Washington. George and Martha Washington never had any kids together, but Martha Washington had a couple of kids from a previous marriage. And so George Washington becomes their stepfather. And Robert E. Lee marries the granddaughter of one of those relatives of George Washington's. And Robert E. Lee fights in the Mexican-American War. He becomes a very well-known general during that war. And Lincoln actually, when the war starts, asks Robert E. Lee to lead the Union Army at the start of the Civil War. But Robert E. Lee says no. He can't fight against what he called his countrymen or his home state. And so he resigned from the Union Army to become a Confederate general. And the important part about this and about Robert E. Lee, we're going to talk a lot about him, is that he became the best general in the South, or of the South, during the course of the Civil War. And even today, he's just as well known as some of the Union generals, and if not more. Robert E. Lee. And then the last person we're going to be talking about here a little bit more in depth is George McClellan. He was a young general, 32 to 33 years old, somewhere in there when he gained control of the Union Army. His nickname was Little Mac, or Young Napoleon. After the failed Peninsula Campaign, he became known as the Virginia Creeper, but his soldiers loved him. They loved him because he trained them. He trained them and created the Union Army. But he moved very slowly into battle. He was always afraid that he was outnumbered, and he missed a number of chances to end the war quickly, and eventually he is fired by President Lincoln. When we talk about President Lincoln's re-election in 1864, one of the people he is running against is George McClellan. But Abraham Lincoln wins that election. So George McClellan is another person that we're going to talk a little bit more about here, but also somebody that could have won the war a couple of times, but because he was so slow to move, did not get that done. All right. I'm going to pause here. We're going to stop here before I talk about the Battle of Antietam. We'll come back and we'll talk about the Battle of Antietam in the next video.